Check, check, 1, 2. Oh. Hey, 1, 2, check, check. Mic check, 1, 2. Testing audio feed for our AV crew in the back. Check, check, 1, 2. How do I sound? Sound check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Hey, 1, 2. Are you getting signal at all? One, two, 1, 2. Check, check. Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Check, 1, 2. Hey, how do I sound? 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2. Check, check, 1, 2.
Check 1, 2. This is a microphone check. Yeah. I'll keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is a microphone check.
I'm actually waiting for him. Good morning and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Nat Malkus. I'm a senior fellow here and the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies. Thank you for coming to this discussion on chronic absenteeism after the pandemic. And what I will argue is the greatest challenge facing public schools today. We have a pretty straightforward event today. I'm going to hog the time initially to go over some of the data that we have collected, which is primarily chronic absenteeism, as well as some of the context with some pertinent data. Fair warning, there will be numbers, lots of numbers. We also have an excellent panel that includes Dr. Lisa Coons, Michael Gottfried, Hedy Chang, and Scott Rocco, who I will introduce more fully when we bring the panel up. And they will help us discuss how we got here and where we are on chronic absenteeism and how we might make headway on this problem. After that, we'll have an opportunity for some audience Q&A, so get some questions ready. We'll also have, for folks who are on the live stream, they can also tune in. We have a hashtag, which is hashtag chronic absenteeism. And once again, let me thank friends here and online and those new to AEI for coming today. So I have been gathering data on a number of things, most recently chronic absenteeism, but I want to put this in context because this is certainly, it wasn't always, but now is a pandemic phenomenon. So this is a timeline of the pandemic in terms of cases. It doesn't come to today because we actually stopped tracking cases in this way in the early summer. But you can see the fall and rise across 3 school years here, and my work dramatically changed that March, right at the beginning of this time frame, when I was wondering what the heck is going on in public schools now that we've closed them all. And I followed that dictum, if you don't have the data that you want, go get it, and that became the Return to Learn tracker. The first year of the pandemic, every week we tracked 8,600 school districts for those that were remote. You can see these for January 4th of that year. The remote ones are in blue. The green ones are those that were fully open, at least with an option for all students. And the yellow are, we call them hybrid, but actually they're somewhere in between. This represents quite a bit of work, and we can aggregate this for the year. This runs from November on the bottom to the end of the school year. And again, you can see the percentage of districts, a little different than the percentage of students, but nonetheless, the percentage of districts in green that were fully open and in person. And that middle category is those that were hybrid, and the blue is the percentage. Again, this covers about 89% of students in 2019. The blue is those that were fully remote. And again, this is a lot of work. We concentrated on school closures because we wanted the data. It's proved very useful. And you can also see some major divides here in this data. So this is, again, this is 2020-21. This is that first full pandemic year. And this is the division that you can see, and this is the political division on it, divided by the presidential vote districts, and you can just see that closures in Biden districts were far higher percentage remote for longer. We can see this in terms of achievement as well. The higher achievement districts on the left tended to be less remote and remote for less amount of time. You can also see it's actually a stronger by minority. And just so you remember, these are not very high and very low minority districts. You're looking at 8,600 districts there. So they're just cut in half. There are some big differences that we can see here. This happened in this first block here, right? And COVID actually was a greater problem the next year, though we didn't have the closures. That was sort of the year of masking fights. And then this last one is the 2022-23 year. And we're going to be looking over this time in chronic absenteeism. But I think it's very important context because it wasn't just closures that are part of this chronic absenteeism story. Schools experienced a lot of exceptional behaviors over this time period. It varied widely, but that includes school closures. It also includes optional remote learning that went on even in schools that were open for students to come by choice. We had these masking fights. We tracked masking. I'm not going to spend much time on it here, but I do think that the big differences we saw in masking are indicative of differences in how schools were either sort of COVID cautious or sort of COVID, I don't know what to call it, but they were, sort of damn the torpedoes, right? Let's forego the masks. You can make judgments about that and still see there were major differences in how schools reacted. There were also quarantines. This wasn't really limited to, this didn't relate to school closures. Of course, if you were closed, quarantining wasn't a problem, but the quarantines plagued schools both in the first and second, and to some degree last year, though much less. And then there were staffing issues throughout this, including staffing quarantines, which just, you put all these things together and you have a rotor wash from the pandemic that was very difficult. And I think it's important to understand that from a holistic standpoint, look, I put a ton of effort into tracking school closures, and it is an important part of the story. It's just not the whole story. This is pandemic learning loss. Many of you probably saw this in the New York Times. This is the Education Recovery Scorecard data. This is fantastic work. It's very important. It covers 39 states. And this shows you a number of things. The first thing it shows you, and the biggest thing, let's not forget, is just how big of a gap there is between the test scores, between the richest and poorest districts. It's the biggest gap we see on this entire map. But we can also see other changes. If you look carefully, you can see the poorest districts at the bottom, they lost more during the pandemic. Their test scores went down further. And their gains, and it's kind of hard to see this, but were slower to recover. And the net is a wider achievement gap across these districts. And you can see this in a lot of test data. The pandemic learning loss is a huge challenge for America's schools. I'm going to argue later it's not the biggest challenge for America's schools. But it is key. It's a key setting for the chronic absenteeism data. What else do we know about who was hit the hardest by pandemic learning loss? It was poorer districts, it was lower achieving districts, and it was districts that were remote for longer, but it was not that as much as differences we see by poverty and by achievement. Let me just also say all those things for the methodologists out there are not multivariate comparisons, so untangling how these things overlay is difficult. So I finally get to chronic absenteeism. I started tracking this about a year ago. I thought, I have all this data on closures. It looks like chronic absenteeism is going to go up. We gathered the data for the same sort of time period that we had all our other data on, whether it was enrollments or anything else. We went back to 2017 to 2023. I got district level data. I think it's very important to look at district level data because there are differences between districts that are very important to view. We got these data from state departments of education, some of which are wonderful. And I will also say that in some of those years, the data were either not supplied, and there is a federal data set which is just not as good. I can go in, you can buy me a cup of coffee and I'll give it back to you so you don't fall asleep while I explain to you why it's not as good, but just trust me, the State Department of Education data is better, so we use that to track over time. And we also, I think the 2023 data is the most important data in this data that we have gathered. It is currently available for 38 states and DC, and we have that at the Return to Learn tracker. Okay, so a quick, I promise I'll take you through these quickly. This is 2017, first of all. Lots of states didn't have data that year. This is 2018. I have it for all the school districts in the nation. This doesn't include the tiny ones. So you can see them. And this is, again, in some states supplemented by the federal data. It's about 15% K-12 chronic absenteeism. Again, chronic absenteeism is students that were absent 10% of the year. That's 10%, not 10 days. It's about 18 days, and it probably averages somewhere on 21 days a year for those that are chronically absent. It's probably higher now. 2019, look at how much change there was. Less than 0.25%. It was very, very flat in these 2 years. In 2020, the data is just not great, and it depends on the state. You just can't trust it. Remember, we shut down all the schools in March. In 2021, the data was interrupted because we had school closures, and it was just, the rotor wash of the pandemic was most intense. And in 2022, you can see the blood on the tracks. It's terrible. This is about a 90% increase across the board in chronic absenteeism. It is not a pointed change. It is all over the place. And then in 2023, you can see it in the states that we have. The ones that really change are the ones that don't have the data up. The other ones dropped a little bit. That is good. I'll argue that they didn't drop fast enough. Let's look at this a different way. The dotted line is the average in 2018 and 2019. Wow, that looks pretty static, doesn't it? In 2023, in 2022 rather, it jumped up to 28% with my data. And again, that's the percentage of students. That's the average percentage of students, not districts. And then in 2023, what you see is a couple of things. First of all, 6 states were essentially the same or actually increased in 2023. The average percentage across the board dropped about 2 points. At that rate, across the board, we'll be back to pre-pandemic rates of chronic absenteeism, which were no great shakes, by 2030. There are differences by districts. These are not small numbers of districts. You are looking at 40 million children in this bar graph. Blue is pre-pandemic, yellow is 2022, where we have the whole country. There's a number of things to see here. Number one, I see differences between high and low achievement, both pre and post-pandemic, and that is true. I also see that the greatest change, at least in percentage point terms, is for the low achieving districts. That is bad. That 36% means that 36% of K-12 students missed more than a tenth of the school year in 2022. The other thing that I think is very important to notice is that as a proportion, it's pretty even. Chronic absenteeism almost doubled for high-achieving districts. It almost doubled for low-achieving districts. You can say the same thing for poverty. You can see the same thing for urbanicity. And no, this is not, well, I suppose it's in the eye of the beholder, but I would say that this is not just an urban problem, at least not one that we should only be worried about. Many people are look fondly on the leafy suburban schools, but more than 1 in 4 kids in 2022 missed a tenth of the school year. By in-person instruction, we see small differences. They are not as large as anything we have seen so far. In fact, by masking the following year, we see a slightly different, although I imagine it's not really substantively different, but those things were also an influence, but it wasn't the whole ball game. I think I've said that enough to make it clear. This is not just a closures story. This is a sort of different set of data. This is that federal data, and it's a little different. And it's also between 2020 and 2022. So this is sort of like early pandemic to late pandemic. Nonetheless, you can see that for Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white students, these are millions and millions of students for each group. This is not all of them, but close to all of them, except for California. And what we see is that they increased very, very similar rates, right? The percentage increases. The percentage point increases are different. We need to hold these two things in our hands at the same time. The chronic absenteeism for Black and Hispanic students is tragic. I mean, 39% of Black students, K-12, were chronically absent in 2022. That is, I'm still gobsmacked by that number. But as an increase over previous behaviors, it's fairly easy, or even rather, not easy. Nothing about this is easy. I have made what I think to some people is controversial, that this chronic absenteeism is the greatest challenge for public schools. And I want to make that case briefly before I bring up the panel. Now, most people, I think, as a knee-jerk reaction will say, the learning loss, Nat, get real. I understand that, and I disagree with it. The first thing is, I think chronic absenteeism, as we're seeing it in this even patterns, represents a cultural change that's going to affect the productivity of schools. Not for the better. I think it's a problem. I don't think that technological innovations or reinventing schools is going to be able to turn around this cultural change. I think we need to change the culture. Chronic absenteeism harms students. It did pre-pandemic. I believe it still will post-pandemic. It also harms schools. And as Hetty Chang will show us, I'm sure, or discuss, it harms a lot of schools. A lot of schools are suffering from high percentages of chronic absenteeism. And the reason that chronic absenteeism is, you can call it the greatest or not, but it's the primary problem, is because until we do something about that, academic recovery from the pandemic, which is significant, is a pipe dream. It is not going to happen. And it is definitely not going to happen for the people that are suffering the most from chronic absenteeism, which are disadvantaged districts and historically disadvantaged students. And the last thing, and I am not the most fun person to have at a cocktail party, but tailwinds and time are running out. Remember that the difference that we saw from 2022 to 2023 was 2 percentage points, and at that pace, we will return to pre-pandemic chronic absenteeism, which was not great. People back then were occasionally calling it a crisis in 2030. But remember, in 2022, we had the Omicron surge. Cases were through the roof. And in 2023, it wasn't anywhere close to that. So that's a tailwind. If we're going to bring down chronic absenteeism, it's probably easiest when the COVID threat, where we saw this growth, disappears. There's no COVID threat to disappear between last year and this year, or at least nothing of similar comparison. So the question is, are we expected to decline at a 2% rate, or are we expected to plateau? And I think that the time is running out, because if we are going to plateau, the culture in schools reifies itself. And if we're going to change it, the time is now. To help us talk about how that might be done, I have a fantastic panel who I'm going to invite now up to the seats, and then we'll hear from them about what we might do about this. All right, transitioning to panel. I took a breath there. So I have a fantastic group, and I want to thank each of you, and I'll introduce you in turn. Dr. Lisa Kuhn, since March 2023, has served as Virginia's Superintendent of Public Instruction and was previously the Chief Academic Officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. Of course, she took over Virginia at a very placid time, so we'll look forward to what she has to say. Michael Gottfried is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. He's the chair of the Division of Policy, Organization, Leadership, and Systems. He is well known, among other things, for his work on chronic absenteeism, which was begun before, not that it was cool, but before it sort of exploded. Also on this scene, before chronic absenteeism sort of raised to its current pitch, Hetty Chang is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absence. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Scott Rocco is the superintendent of Hamilton Township School District in New Jersey and was named New Jersey's 2022 Superintendent of the Year by the New Jersey Association of School Administrators. Thank you all for coming. Now for the questions. Dr. Coons, you took over 10 months ago. When did it become apparent to you that post-pandemic chronic absenteeism was not just a problem, but a new problem, and what has Virginia's approach been to tackling it?
So you spoke a little bit to this. Tennessee's return to school and Virginia's return to school was a very different experience. Virginia as a whole returned to school 44th in the nation. So knowing stats and things like that was an awareness when I came to Virginia. But when we looked at our end of year assessment results, we saw our assessment results, despite all the work, all of the recovery dollars going down and continuing to go down. And we had to really dig in from a data statistics standpoint and figure out what was the correlating factor. And it didn't matter if you were urban, rural, or suburban, your data was going down on a one-to-one rate based on your attendance. And so if you were chronically absent, you were 18% more likely to not be proficient in reading. If you were chronically absent, you were 25% more likely to be chronically absent in math. So we had to look at, from a state perspective, we have all the school districts across the Commonwealth doing a lot of stuff. But what are we saying and what are we putting a stake in the sand as the state to say this matters and this is absolutely essential? So in September, we partnered with the governor to announce an initiative to really focus on not only learning recovery, but attendance and making sure that we made attendance a priority.
Michael, you have been studying chronic absenteeism for a while now. Help us just kind of get the baseline. Feel free to talk about it post-pandemic, but if someone asked you in 2019, tell me about the causes and the consequences of chronic absenteeism, how would you frame that up?
Yeah, first let me say I really appreciate that you think Hetty and I are the hipsters of absenteeism. It's great. Yeah, so going back to 2019, I think some of the same mechanisms as to why we see chronic absenteeism are the same. So I think about it in terms of health, that probably is a given, right? I think about it in terms of school engagement, and that includes both kids and their parents. And I also think about it in terms of routine/logistics. And in my own work, I focus on this last mechanism. And then in that, I think about things like transportation, meals, creating routines among kids. And when there aren't routines, thinking about a break in routines means that there's more anxiety. And there's more anxiety, I don't want to go to school. So I think those three things are all the mechanisms that really still are in play today.
Hetty, you've been tracking this also since before the pandemic. You hipsters know. But this is certainly new levels, like untold. What do you make of the differences in chronic absenteeism we're seeing now compared to the good old days?
Yeah, so I think first in terms of the size and scale of the issue, so we have almost 30% of kids who are chronically absent, depending on which numbers you take. It's not just the 30% of kids who are chronically absent who are being affected now. So with Johns Hopkins, with Bob Alphans and his team, we took a look at the data and looked at school levels of chronic absence. Prior to the pandemic, and we used 17-18 data because that's when the feds decided to make it available at the school level, about a quarter of all kids were in a school with 20% or more levels of chronic absence. Now it's 2/3 of all kids in a school with 20% more levels of chronic absence. And I partnered with PACE in California to take a look at the 22-23 data. And using state data, you can see in 21-22, it was 75% of all schools in California had at least 20% levels of chronic absence. And in 22-23, this year that we're supposed to recover, it's still 68%. So now you're talking about that routine. So it used to be that chronic absence and having those high levels was not the norm. I would argue now it does seem and feel like the norm. And that churn is affecting everyone. It's affecting the teacher's ability to teach, set classroom norms, and kids' ability, to learn in that environment. But I also think there are some pretty significant issues that are fueling this. One issue is, I think those communities, it'd be really interesting to look at COVID rates and COVID death and how that affected where the high levels of chronic absence. Chronic absence is, it's that canary in the coal mine that's both capturing what's happening in schools, but what's also happening in communities. And if you lost a family member, the impact of that is pretty hard to overcome. But I also think there's a real issue of disengagement that feels palpably different. And some of this is a coinciding of factors. Like I keep talking about it. So kindergarten chronic absence is just skyrocketing. And talk about something that's gonna affect us over the long term. If we can't get our kindergartners into a regular routine of school in 5 years, we are really gonna pay for this in different ways. So there's some places where it's really high, but kids and families don't walk onto school campuses anymore. And that's both a function of COVID and a function of school safety. Schools are surrounded by fences. Families don't drop their kids off. They don't see what's in classrooms. And these are families who might not have ever seen what happened in the classroom in the first place. Their kids might not have gone to preschool. So then we wonder, well, how come families don't prioritize going to school every day? They don't know what happens in school every day to make their kids be there. And then they're concerned about the health issues. Because I'm gonna make sure that my baby's safe. So those issues are at a different peak than I've ever experienced before.
Dr. Rocco, you've been a superintendent since the pandemic, and as I understand it, superintendents had a lot of different things going on during the pandemic. At what point, when you were juggling so many different concerns, did chronic absenteeism sort of make it onto the radar where you knew that it's not just something to work on, but this is a new thing? And what have you done in Hamilton Township to tackle it?
So prior to the pandemic, we actually were involved in a grant to deal with chronic absenteeism, but our goal was to keep our schools in the single digits. 8, 9, maybe into the 10%. We had some schools that were 10, 12% chronically absent. Then we went through the pandemic, we closed, then we began to phase in again, and then we opened back up. And as we opened back up, it was warning lights coming on, kids are not coming back. As Hetty said, families weren't coming back. And so we started seeing those numbers go from where we were trying to maintain them in the 8 to 10% range to 18%, 19%, 20%. And so we were still working with numerous organizations to kind of deal with this issue, but some of the work that we had done prior to the pandemic was no longer relevant. Some of the tactics we were using were no longer relevant. The environment had changed, culture had changed, families had changed, the focus on schools had changed, and so we had to retool a little bit as we went along. We work on it all the time. When I meet with my principals, they have 3 goals. They have an academic goal, they have a student behavior goal, and they have an attendance goal. And the point of the attendance goal, not only on the chronic absenteeism rate and bringing that down, is that none of the other things work unless you have kids in school, right? The door has to be open and kids have to come into school. Attendance is the gateway to everything else in our schools, to the learning, to the behaviors, to the interest, to the engagement. So now we are focused on bringing those numbers down. I will say our most recent numbers from January, I have some schools in the single digits again. I actually have one of my high schools, which was floating around 16, 17% last year, is at 9%. And there are a number of things that we are doing, and I'm sure we're going to get into that in a couple of minutes, but a number of things we're doing new now that we didn't do when we were working on it prior to the pandemic. We had to retool.
Michael, I want to start with you, and I don't want to have one-on-one questions, so just jump in if you've got something. But Michael, I've talked to some people about this, and they say, "Wow, maybe they were just sick," because it's excused and unexcused absences. So maybe it's just COVID, maybe it's just sick. And I've talked to other people that would say, "Well, we have these new tools from the pandemic. We got Canvas, we got Google Classroom, we have lots of new tools that we can bring to bear on this. It's not that big of a deal, or at least it's not as big of a deal." From a dispassionate perspective, what do you make of that argument?
So I don't think there's a substitute for not being in the classroom and being at school, right? So it comes as no surprise to all of us who are interested in education that being present, being in the classroom, is not just about learning, but it's also about engaging with classmates, learning to be with adults, learning from different adults. So I think that Canvas, Zoom, Blackboard, Blue Jeans, whatever it's called, is not going to be a substitute. I think you can get some of the material from that. I think that's probably right. Like maybe it shrinks like a minuscule amount. The gap might shrink that much, but I think that's just not going to be a possibility.
Other folks, I mean, let me ask you this. Before the pandemic, we had rates that, they hovered up and down, but they were about 15%. And this was a real struggle. Could it actually be better because of sort of the technologies that we've done, or is it every bit as much of a problem as it always was? I mean, I was talking to a friend, very good friend, who will go nameless for obvious reasons, and he was saying, I work in schools, and I'm not quite sure it's as bad as it was. And I'm not exactly sure what to say to them.
Well, we close schools and we have massive learning loss. So that's fundamental, right? When our schools were closed, our learning loss dropped. But we also know as our students are coming back and in and out, our teachers are struggling to maintain coursework. Their kids are coming with varied learning loss. A student misses it today, a student misses tomorrow. We're making that much harder of a job for our teachers because they can't maintain. We also know our schools are hubs. They're where the mental health supports, where all of those things are. So we're making it harder on our school structures to make sure that they can support the families and the needs when we don't care about chronic absenteeism. And you see this culture of change that you spoke to, where it's harder for teachers, it's harder for the school to maintain, but it's also a perception that coming to school, it was okay during the pandemic for me not to come to school. And now it's changing that entire perception. No, coming to school is important. As you said, it's not just learning to read in person with no mask so I can hear sounds. It's learning my social skills and how to work with a collaborative group to make sure I'm ready for workforce. It's being able to interact and engage in different situations and have conflict resolution and being able to be part of a society. So those things are lost when we don't have the same school climate and culture where people feel the school is a hub. It's an opportunity to engage, and it's critical. We've doubled chronic absenteeism in Virginia, and we're continuing to see the learning loss. But the learning loss also masks all the things that a school can provide for a family and children that we're not having that opportunity to do now.
Hetty hit a point on our kindergartners and getting them into school. There is a segment of our population that they started their schools being remote. They never came in the door for a period of time. But then there's another segment of student that transitioned from elementary to middle to high school that started that transition remotely in a new building. And those groups of students are struggling. Those are the students that don't know the routines and procedures, have difficulty with the social cues, have difficulty with coming to school all the time. And that's not the simple solution of deal with those students and chronic absenteeism goes away, but that's a big pocket of student that is struggling and their families to gain traction of why should we come to school every day? Because what they did is they either started their schooling or transitioned their schooling fully remote. And I think that's a big challenge in one of the pieces of this big challenge.
And Hetty, you've talked to me briefly about this before, about how it's not like chronic absenteeism is just a slice in time, but it's part of a series of behaviors. So if you get it in some grades, you should expect it down the line. I mean, how much do you think this will carry over into the future if sort of left to run its own course?
Well, I think there's both individual and group effects. And one of the things I think, especially Lisa was talking about, is we have underestimated the value of school for socialization for our kids, for us as a country. And Michael's research shows, even before the pandemic, chronic absence was connected not only to academic challenges, but also to executive functioning, to your engagement in school. And all of that started in kindergarten. So the impact on individuals is huge, and we've always known there's a predictive value to chronic absence. If you were chronically absent the prior year, that predicts chronic absence the next year. And then there is, I think, the impact on the groups of kids as a whole. And what you were presenting is what we're seeing is even greater gaps and inequities happening. And what I fear is that the more resource districts are able to put in place things that accelerate the reduction in chronic absence and get back to normal. And then we have a whole set of, especially communities where they were in poverty beforehand, they experienced extreme challenge during COVID, where this is like when we looked at the data, before the pandemic, again, maybe 25% of high poverty schools had 20% or more levels of chronic absence. Now, had at 30% or more levels of chronic absence, sorry. Now it's like 70% of all high poverty schools, with a third of their kids chronically absent. We have to think about and that's just a floor. Some of these schools are 50, 60, 70% chronic absence. And in that situation, it's not just Again, the kids who are chronically absent and affected, it's all the kids. And so even if your family somehow managed to get you to school every day, you're in such a situation where your learning loss is greater. So I think it explains a huge amount of this learning loss. And it also speaks to the need to really to concentrate resources in making sure that it's not just our places that have the wherewithal to get kids back to school. Even you talked about virtual learning and those things. And I actually think we're not doing a good enough job of exploiting the techniques that we learned that could help with kids with virtual learning. But virtual learning also wasn't equal across low-income and high-income communities. Affluent families could go home, they just have a nice little room for their kid and they have decent internet connectivity, and that did not happen for our low-income communities, even if we managed to get them technology. So part of the learning loss that was occurring is because virtual, unless we really resource, and I think digital connectivity for this new world is important for everyone, but not everyone has equal access to use it to complement what's happening in in-person learning. So the dire situation we have is that we're going to have a country of haves and have-nots. And it's not just in their academic achievement, but their ability to connect with other kids, see across differences, resolve differences, which arguably we really need as a country.
Dr. Rocco, Dr. Coons, I have a particular question for you on the technology front that Hetty mentioned. Look, technology brings lots of solutions, and it brings a little satchel of problems as well. And on the one hand, I can see technology being very good on the solution side during the pandemic, and also just terrible for children and undermining connectivity. Is this partially either caused by the increase in screens over the pandemic, or is it made harder?
I think we made the assumption culturally that technology could replace instruction. We said, keep your children home. It's okay, we're going to put them on the computer, they're going to learn, they're going to have these touch points with teachers, it's going to be fine. And we messaged very clearly during the pandemic that this was okay. And we could replace in-person school culture and what happens in school with digital instruction. And now we are at a culture point where parents are nervous, they're uncomfortable, they're worried about sending their kiddos to school. And they're saying, but you said it was okay. You said it was okay to replace what happens in the classroom with a computer. So one of the things we have to do, and one of the things we focused on at the state, is changing that message. It is not okay for you to spend all day on the computer. It is not okay for you to get your sole source of learning from digital technologies. There are digital spaces that are supportive and helpful and can complement what happens in school, but it is not a replacement for what happens in the school day. And that has taken a lot of work. I've talked to business chambers across Virginia, I've talked to families, we've had messaging campaigns, but it is a change in perception that we have to very intentionally take on because we said it was okay. And we gave assurances to the community that it was okay, we could do school this way. And we can't. We know now that we can't. And we have to change that. And our data is very clear on that. So we have to start making sure that in every ounce of our messaging, and we have a chronic absenteeism task force, we had physicians on there talking to the physicians about how they message this to families, talking to our business community about how we message this to their internships and those kinds of things, but making sure everyone has the same message. Being in school is much more important than being on a screen.
So I'm a big tech person, all right? And at the same time, as a superintendent of schools, we're a people business. And who are our clients? They're our students and our families. And being able to do that one-on-one in-person or large group in-person, face-to-face means a lot. That's the way we've always educated. That's the way we make connections. That's the way we help people learn about society and how to interact with society. When the pandemic came and we had to go remote, a lot of us as districts made sure that every one of our students had what they needed to connect. Not necessarily to learn, but to connect. In Hamilton Township, we had a 5-year goal to go one-to-one by 2025. We went one-to-one in 2 months. Then we began to distribute hotspots to our families that did not have adequate or any internet access at home. So we did things, and we were able to do some types of instruction. Some of that instruction, some of our teachers had never been trained to do before. It was out of their wheelhouse, and we caught up. There were some successes and there were some failures during that time, and I would not say that it was overly successful, but I would also say it was not overly a failure. I think we need to take what we learned and the best parts of that and infuse that into coming back to school, because there is a level of interaction that our students will do outside of school that will involve technology. A lot of college classes are online. There are trainings that are online, things like that, and we have to begin to mesh them together. But when we infused that technology and opened the door to learning happening from home to the teacher, I think one of the problems that happened, and I think this hurt us when it comes to attendance, and this hurt us with kids participating, was when the camera went on, you were looking at where a kid lived. And some of those students didn't want you to see that. And when they didn't want to see that, they shut the camera off or they didn't participate. And I think that resulted in kids not connecting with school, connecting with their teachers, and then having a hard time coming back in person afterwards. And that's a struggle that we still are working on right now.
Now, I just want to also, I think there's thinking about technology as a compliment, and it's funny because I've also heard the other part from teachers who said, well, I finally got a window into my kids' life that I never saw, and that actually helped. But I think the bigger challenge, and you talk about this as the culture has changed, we messaged two things incredibly strongly during the pandemic. Digital learning is a replacement for in-person, and it's not. It could be a compliment. And you should stay home for any symptom of illness. And we combine those two things, and we were all really clear. Like, I talked to school nurses who were like, yeah, during the pandemic, I got really good at my job. You're sick, you stay home. You have the sniffles, you stay home. But the situation really has changed. And families are very, very confused. And staff are actually very, very confused. So we don't yet have clear messaging either that no, this isn't a replacement, and two, that actually you should not stay home for any minor symptom illness. And some things like stomach aches are really anxiety, which means you ought to get yourself to school to overcome it, or it's allergies or other things. And so this is where we have to change some of the culture that wasn't actually before the pandemic created, and we don't want to get it reified. We have to change those concepts.
So let me ask about that messaging, because look, this is a message that came through loud and clear, right? There's pandemic, people are dying, here's what you can do. And it is very difficult, I would imagine, to mount a message as effective as turning that back. Dr. Rocco, when you are trying to tell parents, we can change behaviors back. Dr. Coons, and you're trying to get the message out. We need to get off the pandemic footing. How do you do that? How do you get that message out?
So I think that message comes from multiple people over a period of time. There's the message that I put out in community updates and board meetings, superintendent reports, where I'm talking about these are our 3 goals, here's what you need to do, we need you back in school, unless you have a fever or you have something contagious, come back to school. So we're telling everybody at that level. Then the principals are telling it at their level, right? They're messaging that out in robocalls and at PTA meetings and at assemblies and all kinds of things. But I think where it really makes a connection is when the teachers are making the phone call. And even the guidance counselors and the secretaries in the buildings. And I think the untapped resource here of connecting with families is your school secretary. They're the people that see the families coming in and out all the time. They know the children in the family. They know the grandparents in the family. And picking up the phone and making a phone call to a family and saying, hey, I haven't seen Scott in the last couple of days. Is everything okay? They're making those calls now, and so you've got this umbrella statement, these umbrella ideas, the umbrella concepts and data of why it's important to come to school and the impact that chronic absenteeism has on learning and your future. We're saying that. But really getting nitty-gritty, teachers, guidance counselors, and the secretaries in the building. And that's how you're going to make an impact and a connection with the families. And that's one of the missing pieces, is that connection with the family to the school.
Really quickly, I want to say, I have 2 things that I want to say. First, I think that, so when I talk to the press, one thing that I always say nowadays is that The absenteeism crisis feels a lot like the early pandemic. And I think something we saw in the early pandemic for a lot of people was the changing in messaging created distrust, right? And I think that we're talking about changing the messaging, and maybe we're doing a good job at changing those messages, but I'm thinking about the receipt of those messages, right? So imagine putting ourselves back in 2020 when all of a sudden we can sit 3 feet apart, 6 feet apart, 20% full. All of these changes made a lot of people distrust public health. And I think there's an issue with us continuing to change the message and parents saying, well, I don't care. You said it was like that before. I don't want to go back to the way it was. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is we're talking about teachers, and I think this is really important because something I was going to say earlier, but is coming back up, is this is stressing the system. We're putting stress on the system, and I think about teachers a lot, and I have some new work that's under review, fingers crossed, that's looking at how absenteeism at the kid level is affecting teachers' jobs.
Yep.
And teachers are feeling less satisfied by their jobs, by the definition of what it means to be satisfied as a teacher is not making phone calls, right? So teachers don't want to do that. They want to instruct, right? And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I'm saying what's happening from my perspective is teachers feel like they're doing things that they weren't hired to do. And so as a result, and I haven't looked at this yet, there's probably a lot of turnover. And so we're putting a lot of stress on this engine in ways that I think, thinking about absenteeism as an ecosystem, right? So kids are absent, and now teachers have to do things that they didn't think they were going to have to do. There's turnover, there's new teachers, they aren't as good as more experienced teachers, and so forth. So there's this spiraling out of.
I'm concerned about this on a couple of levels. So I know I'm supposed to ask questions, but I'm going to give an answer and then ask you guys to comment on it. But look, I was looking at data from late 2022, the Pulse panel data. And this is data that said, how's chronic absenteeism in your school? Did it get worse over the pandemic? Did it get worse in the past year? And I promise you, they said, yeah, it got worse over the past year. But it also asked about teacher chronic absenteeism. And the numbers were worse. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that teacher chronic absenteeism is worse, but the percentages of schools that said, yeah, teacher absenteeism increased a lot this year from 21 to 22 was very high. That to me is very alarming because I've made the same argument that you were just making, that you were both making. Number one, that teachers are undoubtedly tired, don't really want to do this, but that they are an absolute necessity to carry forward these messages so that they'll pay off, and that if they don't do it, their jobs are not going to get better, right? So it could degrade the way they feel about their jobs, and it could also degrade their jobs over time. I don't know what to make of all those things other than they keep me up.
Nat, so I want to just offer a different little picture of hope. So I spent the first 2 days of this week in a district in California where we went through the data on 1,000 districts. Our attendance works in Collaboration for Educational Excellence to find 20 districts that had lower chronic absenteeism in kindergarten before and then post-pandemic. And our wonderful task is to go, what makes them better? And I just spent 2 days in this district. And what was totally clear was that teachers were at the heart of making this difference. And these teachers were not tired. They were good with asking questions. They had this incredible way of talking to the kids when they came in the morning. Who's missing? Oh, we missed them. Making sure kids felt missed. Talking about attendance when they're doing their parent-teacher conferences. Really feeling comfortable talking with families, and they were using their data all the time to figure out and go on home visits whenever someone was missing. But what I saw was a couple things that made this work. One was they had an incredible investment in health and well-being of both the teachers and the kids. They had a school nurse who they talked about during the pandemic. She was contact tracing, checking in on everyone, both the teachers who were sick and the kids. They felt loved and cared for by their district around their own well-being, their mental health well-being, and then speaking of like trust for families, because one of the issues is families are like, especially in California, which is an ADA state, in some places you get, the schools are just saying to come back to school because that's going to get them more money. They don't care about the health of our kids. And I talked to this parent who has a kid with asthma who talked about bringing her kid, and that she trusted putting her kid with asthma back in this classroom because her teacher would even call her and say, so-and-so was coughing a little today. I'm a little worried about it. Maybe what? So she knew that if I have this kid, there's health supports, there's a teacher support, they're watching it, and my kid with asthma wants to be in school, and I trust my school to have them there. So when they tell me, send my kid to school, I'm gonna do it. But the one other thing I would say that they did as a district is it was interesting. They've been investing in Second Step curriculum, at really a kind of a looking at whole child. I know social emotional isn't always whatever the language, but it's really making sure that paying attention to kids' well-being and health and their social skills and their ability to make sure that if they make a mistake, they feel like they can learn from it, they can improve in it. And the superintendent talked about when the pandemic hit, he got, advertised millions, here's the new curriculum you can take on. He said, nope, I'm gonna stick with what I have. I'm gonna make sure my teachers learn it. They can do it in the classroom. And they've done that around reading, on math. They didn't bombard their teachers with a new thing to learn all through that. They stuck with what they knew so that it's like integrated throughout their work. So paying attention to health, investing in nurses, that's actually going to want to be one of their challenges. As COVID relief dollars go down, where do they keep the money? Because they expanded all their health services, but also making sure that they were really thoughtful about not adding in so many reforms that teachers got burned out trying to implement something new all the time.
I think there's another piece to it too. If our teachers are isolated and they feel like they have to do all these things alone, if our school principals are isolated and they feel like they have to make all these home visits, and our districts feel like the weight is only on them, then it's that same exact feeling we had during the pandemic, right? Like, I have to do this by myself. So one of the things that we've really focused on is making sure there's an action toolkit, a short toolkit. Here are resources, teachers. Here, superintendents, here are resources. You can think about it as a school district. Principals, here's a very simple set of 3 resources that you can think about. Teachers, here's something. Giving tools and then giving connectivity. We have created a statewide chronic absenteeism task force to help build tools, but then to help spread tools and connect superintendents to talk to each other, connect principals to talk to each other, connect teachers, to make sure people feel connected in the resources so they're not constantly doing things on their own. Because we can't ask teachers to do more and more and more and more. So if you have an attendance clerk, how do they connect with the teacher for the kid who has the sniffles, or the child who doesn't seem to have clean clothes and is uncomfortable to come to school? How do you connect? And I think that's an important piece for us all to think about, is how are we connecting around the work, not asking people to do more and more and more in isolated spaces. So we have to be cautious, as Hetty said, about adding to people's plate and asking them to do something different, but we also have to make them feel connected and that they can use each other to solve a problem that's not going to solve at 2%. It's going to continue to cause more challenges.
Michael, you've been studying this for a long time. So, easy question here. Where's the low-hanging fruit, man? What do we go out and do where we can get some quick fixes on this?
Yeah, so I have a couple of new grants that's answering that question. So there's, like the early pandemic, right, a lot of things are being tried, right? And I feel like it was the same when we're talking about health as it is with this chronic absenteeism crisis. So we see schools and districts trying a lot of things, and some of the things work, and some of the things don't work. And questions I get is, well, what do I do? And so I have new work that is going to take all of these studies and take stock of what we know, what effects are the largest, but what's important that grounds a lot of my work is what's scalable and replicable, right? So if this is working in California with the districts you saw earlier in this week, how do we know it's going to work in DC and Philly and Boston and so forth?
And in this case, we saw the data, right? I mean, you got to have something that can scale and replicate.
That's right.
And quickly. We don't have much time.
That's right. And that's
but anyway, keep going.
You presented rural, and that's also something I'm thinking about also, because rural is often ignored, right? But rural comes with fewer resources than we have in our cities. And so it's easy to create partnerships between UT Austin and Austin schools. And I have a colleague, Josh Childs, who we both know, who's doing just that. But when you're not in Austin and you're in rural Texas and you don't have those mentors that are accessible to schools, what's going to work there? So I really do worry about replicability when we think beyond just the cities and suburbs.
But I think sometimes we we need to think about concepts that can get implemented in different ways across places. I think the lowest hanging fruit is relationship building. The most important thing is kids need to know that when they walk into school, there's someone who cares about them, that parents have someone who they can connect to. And we need to organize schools so that relationship building is the heart of how we structure what happens in the classroom, what happens with advisories, what happens with how we bring parents back into the classroom, and what are the opportunities to do that might look different in a rural versus urban area. But everyone can find a way to make sure relationship building over time is part of what happens in how the school day is organized and the kid and family experience of school is so that they can forge strong relationships, both with adults, but also with peers. And if we can do that, I think we can get so much further, because even the messaging that we want to do is going to fall on deaf ears if they don't trust the person who's offering that message. It is really in the relationship building. And I wonder about, like, even when you talk about what's happening in your high school with its 9%, which is incredibly low, I would bet relationship building is a huge piece of that.
It is, and first of all, when I saw 9%, I said, check the numbers again. Is that right? I wasn't sure I was looking at the right thing. I put my glasses on. But yeah, it is. I think it's relationship building, both from the perspective of the families and the staff, but also the leadership of the building with their staff, building that relationship. And if you can build that positive relationship or rebuild it, I think is more appropriate, rebuild it at this point, that's going to flow into the classrooms with the students and the teachers, and then that's going to flow into the community of the school that it serves. And so, yeah, I think that's part of the piece that we can do now.
Part of this, though, it seems like in the places where we will need this the most, right? I want to build relational capital. When I build it up, I can more effectively bring people back. The only problem is the places where I have the most people out are the places where it's harder to build relational capital. If I have so many absences, I believe that that's going to be a less cohesive environment, both for teachers and students, but also for students with students where you have that much missingness. I mean, doesn't it both represent the most durable solution, but also part of the challenge, especially post-pandemic?
Well, I think when you have high levels, it means you have to have more people helping you do it. Yeah. We have, for example, expanded learning programs. So often, expanded learning programs are the stepchild that no one thinks about, which they don't even talk with the teachers, when they could be an incredible resource for, let's say, student connectedness, making sure kids feel as an adult who cares, making sure that they're connected to other kids, making sure they're involved in pro-social. But our expanded learning programs, part of the school attendance team, our expanded learning programs, are you even sharing with them who are the kids that you could reach out to because they've had chronic absence and the challenges? A lot of places that doesn't happen. Or, I see folks here who do a lot of home visiting, and for a moment in time, you invest more heavily in bringing external partners who then, like this is when you think about Connecticut, the LEAP programs, part of what they were also doing was they were making sure that you added home visitors who then connected kids and families back to their teachers and schools. But you might have to invest more heavily in that till you can get it more back down to a reasonable level. Or if you think about peer mentoring, high school kids are an incredible untapped resource for mentoring and connection. And we could be paying them wages. That way we deal with the fact that a lot of them feel like they got to earn and help them do peer mentoring. There's a whole history of that. We have to get a lot more creative about who can do this relationship building and not just put it on the backs of teachers, but bring in many more people who can support them in doing that.
And I think you said something really important about trust, right? We have to go back to trust. I think in communities, one of the things we've been thinking about, if we care and we trust our pediatrician, how can the pediatrician help re-engage families to school? If I have an employer that I feel connected to, how do we help our employers bring people back to school? How do we work within those centers of trust? If I am in an interfaith organization and I go to church, how do we bring stakeholders together? Because it cannot just be the school that's re-engaging families back into the importance. Hetty talked about some of our families in kindergarten have never been in school. They don't understand what school is. It's this place. You tell me I need to go. I may not want to go, but there's someone in the community that I trust. How do we have everyone speaking that message and moving families to know, actually, there are mental health resources in your school. There are food insecurity resources in your school. There's transportation solutions in your school. There are ways for you to get a job in your school community with our wraparound support. So how do you connect them? It's really going to those places where people trust in their community and helping build a coalition around attendance matters. It matters for kids to come to school. It matters for all of us. And how do we start seeding that with all of our stakeholders, where our families go for trust to make sure they're coming back to school?
I think that's a really good way to, so I'm reading Demon Copperhead right now, which is relevant because it's about rural. So I'm going back to rural one more time because I'm thinking about, there are kids in this book and there are kids in rural America that have never been to the pediatrician or the dentist, right? So I'm thinking about how do we get the message out to those students who have never been there. So, but I would like what you said about wraparound services. And I think that's right. I think there have been cases in California, I think it was West Contra Costa County, where they had a dental van that went from school to school. And if you were there on Tuesdays, the dental van came to your school. So thinking about services at the school, so the school becomes the community. And I think that word spreads, right? So using the pediatricians when that's available, but in cases where kids haven't been going to pediatricians on a regular basis, I think adding that to the school is absolutely right.
One thing, I also think we got to do things that create distrust. So our work on attendance and chronic absence is laying on top of a 150-year history of truancy, where the assumption of truancy a lot of times was blame. Kids and families aren't coming because they don't care, when that's mostly not the case. We have in California notifications of truancy that have mandated language that say, if you don't start showing up to school, I'm going to take you to court. And we have a lot of families, and I'm now hearing it from more affluent families who never used to get those notifications, but because of kind of what's happened with the pandemic, they are. And when they get it, the distrust and the feeling that this is a school that doesn't understand me, doesn't understand my challenge, actually grows. So we have things that we're doing that we are actually creating disengagement at the very moment when we have to partner with families and kids in order to understand the issues and have them feel faith in schools. So we got to also look at what are all those things we're doing that create distrust. And I think some communities, low-income communities, communities of color, there's some deep distrust that we're going to have to stop and change in order to create those partnerships that we know that get kids back to school.
I see how many of the wraparound services approaches and so forth can be beneficial. And I want to encourage support students need to return. On the one hand, I can hold that in my hand. But I can also hold in my hand that I don't think those challenges went up by 90% over the pandemic. Right? I mean, it just doesn't track with the changes in my mind. I haven't done the regressions on this, but I just don't see the descriptive statistics lining up. So I'm trying to figure out how much of this, certainly let's bring supports, but we also have to change behaviors. And then what will we need to do to change those behaviors? And one of those things I think we need is on the messaging front. Like, how do you pierce this thing? And we have seen this in the research on tutoring, right? We've given out tutoring. It's available. 4% of kids use it. We know more than 4% of kids should be using it, but the uptake is kind of low. So there's something on the demand side that's not penetrating. As far as getting out that message so that we can change people's minds about it's important to get back in school and to change sort of those mental precursors for this kind of behavior. And also behavior that wasn't perfect, but wasn't so much different just 4 years ago. What do we need on that messaging front?
I think if you say chronic absenteeism, you're getting that negative construct that Hetty just talked about. If you say attendance matters, you being in school matters, you being here matters, and why it matters, and being clear and concrete in everyone, so everyone has the same message. It matters if you're here. and creating that culture again, that it matters that you're present, is an important space. It can't just be the state superintendent. It can't just be the teacher. Everyone has to be saying, hey, there's a kid on the street. Where should they be? Because attendance in school matters. So that you create a culture that attendance matters. And so that may start with a social media campaign. It may start with that, but it becomes this whole fabric where we're changing culture, and we've talked a lot about that today. It's about changing, that attendance matters. Your teachers are doing hard work. There's tutoring there. There's wraparound support, so it matters that you come to school. It matters that you go to work. It matters when attendance actually makes a difference, because as we talked about, our messaging during COVID was you have the sniffles, stay home, and we have to change. I know it's a shift, but we have to restate, we learned, and attendance actually matters.
I really like that. So something I say is positive, not punitive.
Right.
And I think, like, you're right, even saying chronic absenteeism, like, I am chronically absent, that's not positive.
Right.
Right, so we're framing this whole thing in a way out to families potentially in a negative way. I think the other thing that I've learned from the work is that the message has to be really simple, and it has to be in the 2020s, right? So sending home flyers isn't working. Sending home a lot of data isn't working. I think quick messages, we've seen text messages, that's been working. So keeping it short, but I also like just keeping it positive.
I think the messaging, though, happens throughout the school year in different events, too. So if you all think back to why you wanted to go to school or what interested you in school, some it was a class, some it was an activity, some it was a sport, some it was playing an instrument, whatever the reason was. We have to get back to also engaging families and students into the things that interest them to come back into school, and then you message that out. The importance of being here, the importance of having a family present at a night event, bringing your children, explaining why it's important to be here. So, right, you don't say, hey, if you don't show up, this is what's going to happen, but your attendance does matter. We appreciate you coming today. And my principals, they'll run all kinds of different events. And when I was doing a meeting last week with one of the principals, a non-tenured staff member, she said, I only had 6 families that came. And I said, don't be disappointed with 6. I said, that's 6 more people that you got to message out about the importance of the event, the activity, your kids, the school. Maybe next time it'll be a dozen, maybe it'll be 18, whatever it is, but you made a small dent at this time. So we have to bring families in, and that messaging has to be clear but simple, just as you said. But you have to also find reasons why the families want to come back, things that excite them, things that interest them. Get the kids back in the door. If you have an event that the kids are interested in, the parents are going to come too. And that kind of makes that connection. And then you can message out. You can message out to parents why you appreciate them being there and why it matters that they're there. And you hope that that then transcends into the next event and into the community with a conversation among neighbors. And you hope that that helps and builds as you go along.
Dr. Rocco, I imagine that for the principals in your district, that you bear some responsibility for sort of both setting the direction, but also saying, we're going to push on chronic absenteeism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in their buildings, they can push on their teachers and on their students and families and say, we're going to work on chronic absenteeism. That cover that you give them by pushing from the top really helps. Have you gotten that kind of, have you gotten what you would think of as sufficient sort of pushes from folks like, Governor Murphy, who can give you and I'm not asking you to call out your governor, I'm asking you whether the folks that have the megaphones that can get more traction on a problem that's hitting everywhere from Alaska to Wyoming are loud enough. And I'll give you my bias is not loud enough, not early enough, and not often enough. But I do indeed want to hear what you all think.
I think it could be more. I think organizations, nonprofit organizations could jump in and assist, but I will say this. We have been blessed with the fact that we have worked with 2 great nonprofits, Princeton Area Community Foundation, who has provided us some grant funding to work on this over the last couple of years, and they have been partners with us, and I think that's the key piece here. And then Young Audiences, which does performance art and art with kids, and that goes back to my comment about bringing people in and getting kids interested in different activities and events. But I think that at the state level, county level, there could be more. There could be more assistance. There could be more using the megaphone, using some influence. But at our level, superintendent's level, through my principals, we keep the message consistent and try to engage the families in different ways. I have 24 different buildings, so one cookie cutter model does not work at all 24. They have to adapt and adjust and create different environments for the different families.
Lisa, I'm going to let you answer quickly, and then we're going to move to audience Q&A, so just hold on for just one more moment. Lisa, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I'm really proud of our governor. In September, when we looked at our academic data, he said, attendance matters. Your kids have to come to school to have the opportunity to work with great teachers and recover learning. And so we started a governor's chronic absenteeism statewide task force. We have communicated that enough that you can see it all over our superintendent's social media, and you can hear the legislative members talking about chronic absenteeism in their subcommittees. So I think it's essential for that megaphone to be led by your governor, to be led by the state agencies, to be communicated, but not to drop. It's not like a one-time, hey, we had a press conference kind of thing. It has to be an ongoing message that all the other things we do in education, all of the tutoring, all of the rigorous programming, all of the great things our teachers are working on, they don't matter if kids aren't coming to school. And that has to come from every bully pulpit that you can have in a consistent, ongoing way. And it has to be clear and it has to be simple. And I do think it has to be positive.
Okay, so we're going to now turn to audience Q&A. I think we have some folks with some microphones in the back. So raise your hand and I'll just point you out. Please give your name. We have two rules in here when we do Q&A. The first one is please give your name and your affiliation so we can know who you are. And the second one is ask a question. Okay, so if I have a hand out here, right here in the front, right here.
Thank you. David Heber, the CEO of Concentric Education.
David, here you go. There's the microphone.
Good morning. David Heber, CEO of Concentric Educational Solutions. We focus on home visits, mentoring, and tutoring. During the pandemic, Hetty, we've been having this conversation for years. Chronic absenteeism has a negative connotation, as we said, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's a 150-year challenge. Just like the opioid issue is now a public health issue because it's expanded outside of Black and brown and poor white communities. That's what chronic absenteeism is. We've tackled it with some very similar issues. Attendance agents, which doesn't go over in poor and impoverished communities. Truancy officers, really about the language. It's very interesting. If you look at the dynamics in this room, there's a misrepresentation. I think I'm a handful of a man of color. Right? Like we mirror some of the very challenges that we're trying to fix. To your point, Hetty, if you can expand on it, none of this stuff works. And we've done 80,000 home visits just within the past 3 years. If you don't look at it one door at a time, meaning they don't respond, families, unless they actually know that you care, you can't work your way out of chronic absenteeism through policies, and it has to be through practices and connecting with children and families. And if you bring them back, because the best way to reduce chronic absenteeism is to keep them engaged, right? But we just don't do a good job. So I would venture to say, how can we change the language? Here's the question part. Instead of saying attendance matters, you being engaged matters. Because most of us here, we were engaged, and that's why we went through school and we had caring adults. Many of us had leg ups. Right? But when I got disengaged, when I got kicked out of 5 high schools, the schools didn't give a damn. There wasn't that caring adult. So to your point, Hetty, how can we push the narrative that this is when everybody else moves on and chronic absenteeism is not the challenge, it is not the headline, and we'll still be here fighting the fight. How can, and everybody will move on to study something else. How can we continue the message that it has to be one family at a time?
I think the challenge, well, one, absolutely it has to be one family. It's that relationship building with each kid, and we have to look at systems at the same time. I think that's the challenge of how do we do both. So I was thinking about this, that I think kids and families come to school when they feel hope for a better future, faith that the school they're in will get them to a better future, voice in the pathway, and access to the supports and resources that will get them there. And for every family, when you reach out to them, when you, I know, at Concentric finally break through, it's because you're, what's the name? You guys have a name for them.
PSAs.
Professional student advocates, because they connect with the family on a level that the family feels hope. and they feel like there's someone who cares. But then the issue of voice and access to resources is sometimes a systems issue. And Nate, you were talking about, Nat, sorry about that. Nat, you were talking about the fact that, it doesn't feel like it's doubled everywhere, the stress and the challenge. I think it depends on which kind of community you're in. In our high poverty communities who were devastated by the pandemic, they lost family members, they lost incomes, their housing is more unstable than ever before. The community violence is high, because we've, as systems, not supported. It looks different than middle-class families whose kids are chronically absent, and there are more middle-class families whose kids are chronically absent than ever before. Some issues cut across. The stay home for any symptom of illness cuts across. The anxiety issues, to some extent, cut across, though I think there are some deeper issues. But then there are basic human resource issues that are happening in communities, and we have to acknowledge that what does it take to give every kid and family hope, faith, voice, and access to resources might have to look different, and we have to organize our systems so they support that both in our more affluent communities as well as in our high poverty communities. And that might not, equitable sometimes isn't the same. Equitable is deeper investments because as a country, we suffer when we allow for the huge gaps in inequity that are now growing.
I told the internet that I would take questions, always a dangerous thing, so I want to put one of these out here. And this is a pretty straightforward one. If the children are not attending school, where are they going? And what are they doing during the day? I mean, this is just a lot more absences. And I'm curious, Dr. Rocco, maybe you could tackle this, but this includes sick days and just truancy, to just be simple about it. What are they doing? What are kids doing?
Obviously not in school, right? So they're home. They're home. They're out in the community, and when they're not in school and they're not where they should be, and they're not learning, that has a potential to be a problem down the road. But where are they going? They're not going to the same place. I think a lot of them are staying home though.
I would just add to this, I haven't done a report on this because by grade, it's only one state or another, but the differences across grades have also been relatively even. So yes, high school was worse, kindergarten was worse, and the growth is even greater there. But the lower rates in the middle elementary grades, they also went up sort of 90%. So it is a really interesting question that I have no idea what is spent with this time. Lisa?
I actually think the question is, what are they not doing? They're isolated, they're not engaged, they're not connected, and they're not part of a community, right? So yes, they're not at school, but they're also isolated and being disconnected. So when you look at those conditions, I have more mental health issues, I have more health issues, so that perpetuates not coming to school. So if we think about, we probably would need trackers to know where they all are, but they're not connected anymore. They're not a part of the community that is their school. They're not engaged in those events that we used to enjoy about school, and they're not connected to those wraparound resources that are in the school. So where they are, great question. Where they're not and what they're not getting is what I think is the more important question.
We might also need to take the data and look at it a little more deeply. I think there are a bunch of high school kids who they're working, they're taking care of their siblings. They have this whole set of responsibilities, especially again in low-income communities. And then there's a whole group of kids who are not connected and doing all of those things, or they're with family members and with the youngest kids. There are also a group of kids who've been lost to the public school system, if you will, completely. And there's an increase in homeschooling. There's an increase in other ways where, again, I worry about isolation. Because, I think you can do some homeschooling really well, but how do you make sure that when that's happening, kids aren't getting completely disconnected from their communities is my concern. And then there's some kids who we can't find at all.
Yeah. It's interesting on that question, the Alec McGillis piece in ProPublica recently, he was talking to some folks on the ground and they mentioned lots of things that were struggles, and one of the people on the street, I don't know who it was, just said, well, some of them just want to stay home on their phones. And I know a lot, we see that with adults too. It's not just like, well, it's the kids. Everybody is sort of zoned out a little bit there. And it's worrying about how do you take care of both problems? Because I think to some degree, that one that I don't know, both are part of it. Did we have another question from the, right here?
I'm with Castle, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, and I'm also a former elementary school teacher, assistant principal, and also a parent of 2 kids in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I come to this multiple angles. I have 2 questions. In this conversation, I've heard relationship building with adults and each other, safe environments, trusting relationships, thinking about making sure kids are connected to their teachers. But we have, I think that, and you've been talking about messaging, that there's a culture change, which is the messaging around the culture change, the technology, approaches to learning, where you could learn. But I think there's one messaging piece that was grossly not talked about, which was the political messaging. We have politicians with megaphones at the state, local level, just across the line, saying the exact opposite messages to families, that your kids don't belong, you don't belong, your kids don't belong, we don't want. So when we talk about chronic absenteeism, I think we need to have a real conversation of what are the other messages that kids who don't fit traditional norms, whether it is because race, ethnicity, culture, class, language, whatever the othering is, and the impact that that's having not only on the families, but the students in wanting to return. And then my other question, so number one, how do we deal with folks that have the megaphone that are sending the exact opposite messages that you all just talked about? And then the second is, when we talk about engaging student interest, at what point do we talk about the curriculum and what kids are learning is the same as it was when I was in school in the 80s, as, you know, like, at what point do we evolve and teach kids to be prepared for the future and not the same worksheets, et cetera, from the past?
So Nat, I'll go on the first one on the messaging. I'll go back to your question about our governor. I just want to clarify also, he's been very supportive in funding us and trying to fully fund all of our schools. But I'll go back to your question on messaging and coming from higher up and megaphones and maybe not necessarily the most positive messages. Our principals put out a lot of messaging, and I'll give one example. One of my 3 high schools is the most diverse high school in our district, probably somewhere around 20% African American, 40% Hispanic, and probably another 40% white, give or take some other demographics in there. My own children have gone there. My youngest is now a junior there, and their motto is a family united. And that rings true in everything that they do. But I'll tell you where it became a point where I understood that the community got it too recently. So we all know there's lots of dialogue on Facebook when somebody puts a post out, and it's not always good when it comes to the schools. And a question came up from a family in the community. I'm thinking about moving to, you know, a part of town. What do you know about this one high school? And I was really concerned about what the messaging would be. Every one of the messages, and there were 20 or 30 of them, minus one, was positive. And what were they talking about? A family united. And I think it's important when you talk about the negativity coming from all over the place is to keep to your core message of coming together, making sure everybody understands it, but then more importantly, everybody feels it. They feel like they belong, and the activities and the events and the experiences connect so that it's not just words, it's an experience.
I have another question from the internet. This one's a little bit long and small. So this is about the enforcement of truancy laws. It says, to my ear, many of the solutions offered have seemed to depend heavily on personal relationships and effective local implementation. But isn't a more scalable and replicable solution to the problem to bring back that instilled the norm of regular school attendance in the first place? That is, getting law enforcement involved and issuing fines and other sanctions to parents whose kids are chronically absent. Is anyone trying this? Or does that undermine parents' rights to educate their children in how they choose?
I don't know if anyone's trying it, but I think there's a movement, at least from the attendance community, to go more positive. So I think the idea of bringing back the juvenile justice system into this sounds very
And
threatening.
did it ever
but
really
no,
go
there's-
away?
No, well, I want to say all of the research that has looked at when you've brought in fines, when you've brought in the legal system, shows that attendance gets worse. It does not improve attendance. If we look at they did a South Carolina study and they looked at all the kids who went into either the probation or in a court system. What works to improve attendance is to understand why kids are missing school in the first place and then address it. And in fact, when you have unexcused absences, if an absence is unexcused, it starts to undermine the engagement of kids from day one because teachers, when absences are unexcused, in many places don't have to help them make up for the classroom, the lost instruction in the classroom. Teachers can deny them opportunities to take the test. Teachers can say you can't go on the field trip. Now, let's say you got 2 kids. They're both 5 days sick, and one kid has health care and one kid doesn't. So the kid who doesn't come in with a note, and they're considered unexcused absences. They get no support, and then they start getting fines if it continues to accumulate because they're now disengaged because no one helped them make up for what was missed in the classroom. So we got to understand that there isn't any evidence that the negative approaches work. There is evidence that relationship building does.
I want to take a little bit of a different approach. Instead of the juvenile justice system, we have a couple of school districts in Virginia who ask kids to come back. So you missed a day. Okay, we have this after-school program. We'd like you to add time back. And that, to Hetty's point, at that time back, so you have after school time. You missed for 3 days, you had bronchitis. We understand you were sick, but we need you to come back because school's important. And during that time, you have a teacher, you have a guidance counselor, you have an attendance specialist, you will have those resources that engage you. So it holds you accountable because you missed and you have to make up that time, but you are attached to resources in that time. So it's a little bit, our data on these models are working really well right now, and they are reducing the attendance because we are saying attendance matters. We're not just saying it, we're showing it. You missed, so we need you to come in. We will work with you to figure out when that is, but you missed an important time during the day, so we are going to ask you to come in at a different time, and we're going to give you the instruction you missed and the supports and the conversation with the attendance specialist that digs into some of those personalized root causes that might be why you're missing. So I think there's a middle ground where you're not being punitive and negative, you're sticking with that positive spaces, but to your point, you're re-engaging because you're making sure those resources are there and you're getting at that part about why that student might not be coming to school.
I think it's an interesting question, and there's different phases here. We could say, let's send out the truancy officers and make sure they're wearing boots. You know, I don't think anybody's looking for vindictive punishment. But at the same time, I think there's concern that if we don't say, you have to go to school, we will insist that you go to school. We will provide supports aplenty, and we will insist that you go to school, that you are much less likely to turn around sort of a rising tide that we're seeing, huge, effectively. So I worry that the idea that, well, we should only bring positive supports, and we should not have expectations at any level. And this, again,
I don't think that's the same thing.
Well, let me finish. I think the other thing is that it doesn't have to be the courts to bring consequences. I was talking to someone who used to run a school, and he said 6 years ago, if you had 10 absences in a semester, you didn't get credit for your high school course. And you could be excused, and there was an appeal process, but he said that made a difference. And then the administration decided, you know what, we're getting too many complaints about this, so we're going to let it go. And no one tracked whether it is causally related, but there's a logic model there that at least makes you think, are we doing kids favors if we don't hold them to task for coming to school, which we know benefits them?
So I think there's a difference, but we should set high expectations, and we can create, and what you were talking about, accountability around showing up to school. I think that is true. And I think what we have to look very carefully is how we do that in a way that both holds kids accountable and understands and recognizes barriers and helps them solve that. I even think, and some cases there have been court legal action at the very last end, which has been beneficial when the legal action is a last resort and the court system is trained and works in a way so that resources to address barriers are brought into it. So it's not saying, by saying we don't want punitive action is not the same thing as saying I'm not willing to set high expectations and create accountability. So I just think, so what we have to think about is what are the appropriate ways that are responding to what's happening in the world that create accountability and set expectations. And I think that this issue of how you do it in grades, how do you do it in that's actually an area worth a lot of exploration that are not about criminalizing kids, but are about setting appropriate expectations and accountability.
All right, well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. I want to thank my audience, those online who are watching, certainly my panelists. I know you all have many things to do, and I appreciate you spending 90 minutes with us. Thank you very much.